All right, team, welcome back to another video today with a deep dive into the lower body, in particular to the foot. So today we're going to look at pronation and supination in particular and why they are important for street lifting. I'm doing this series because I'm hosting the next cohort of the biomechanics mentorship, and the stuff that we're covering there goes really deep, and therefore I just want to give you a superficial overview what kind of topics we are talking about and why they actually matter for street lifting, and to understand the whole body and the whole system so we can apply those things to our training and improve performance outcome. So with today's lecture we want to cover in particular the lower limb, most importantly the foot, and we're going to talk about mechanics, force transfer, and how we can sequence pronation and supination and leverage that to our benefit. And yeah, let's get started. When it comes to the lower body or the foot itself, it goes beyond a static posture, right? The lower limb is designed to manage forces and manage load. Okay, if you think about, you hit the ground with your heel, with your foot every time you take a step, right? And the foot is actually your point of contact with the ground, and it gives you an input of what happens up the chain. And in today's lecture, we're going to cover three phases. Basically, we're going to take a look at the anatomy, we look at assessments, and finally some training progressions and how we can use it to improve our training. And when it comes to anatomy, we only care about insofar that it affects force transfer, right? And the sequencing. So for a street lifter, this is actually the difference between a smooth PR or a leaky lift, where energy is lost through the joint, through the system. We cannot really produce loads of force into the ground. Now, the core philosophy behind pronation and supination is yielding and propulsion. You might think, what the hell is he talking about? Yeah, I know. There are two distinct foot shapes, right? We've got pronation, that's our yielding strategy, that's our force absorption strategy, okay? So basically we are going to dampen the impact and the access to the ground. And then we've got supination. Supination is force production, is about stiffening, okay? And it's kind of the rigid lever that helps us push off the ground when we're sprinting, when we're walking. And in a heavy squat, you must transition from a yielding foot on the way down to a stiffening foot on the way up, okay? And if you cannot alternate between those two shapes smoothly, you have a timing problem. And if you have a timing problem, that's usually not about weak muscles, but you've got a big problem when it comes to producing force, right? Because if you cannot supinate or propel off, how the hell you want to be efficient with your movements, right? So, two distinct foot shapes. If one is missing, the other one is restricted. So keep that in mind. Then we need to talk about some bony landmarks and some important parts and mechanisms at the foot itself. And we're gonna start at the rear foot. This is basically the heel, okay? The heel, also called the calcaneus, is kind of the force absorption piece of the foot, okay? And this piece dictates what is happening up the chain, okay? Literally, what is happening in your shin, in your femur, in your hip, lower back, and so on. And that's why the foot is so important, okay? Sometimes the foot is obviously taking the bill for a restricted hip or if the hip cannot move properly, we will see signs somewhere else, and usually it shows up at the knee or at the foot. But we can also have the bottom-up approach, right, where the foot gives us inappropriate input and will get the issue up the chain. And when we talk about the rear foot, right, it's our shock absorption and orientation structure, and the heel here behind is the calcaneus. And this calcaneus moves in the frontal plane. That means it moves inward and outward. You might think, okay, that's weird, but this is very important. As the foot pronates, as we flatten out the foot, as we yield, the heel must evert, okay, so the heel must drift out to the side. If that is not happening, then pronation is blocked. If pronation is blocked, we cannot move into supination, okay? Can you see that there is the sequencing problem? And also, if the heel stays everted way too long, then we cannot properly supinate again, okay? So it's of utmost importance that the heel knows how to move properly. And we also need to keep in mind that if that heel is not moving, we will see compensations elsewhere. And yeah, that usually then shows up by the ankle dumping inward, the knee dumping inward, or the whole arch just kind of dropping entirely. So for proper pronation, we need the heel to be in contact with the ground, but not too long and not too short, okay, so that we get the actual pronation abilities. Because pronation is super important, as I said, to move into a more rigid foot shape, which is then needed to produce force. And the mechanism that is required, or that helps us to propel off the ground, is the so-called windlass mechanism. And the windlass mechanism works very well along the midfoot and forefoot. And I like to call the windlass mechanism kind of our gearbox, okay? And what it does stretch the plantar tissues, okay? So as we flatten out the foot, the plantar tissues, so the tissues at the bottom of the foot, get stretched. Then when we kick off the ground, they suck together, okay? So they've stored elastic energy. That elastic energy releases, it pulls the foot together, and it stiffens the foot up as we push off the ground and propel away. And when we talk about the midfoot, right? The midfoot is in particular only this part here. And most people tend to mess this up. They tend to cue more so the forefoot being further forward, and that is usually driving compensations. So whenever you want to think about using the windlass mechanism to your benefit and to improve your squats, you should actually be thinking about smashing this part of the foot into the ground to actually unlock proper pronation, and then use the windlass mechanism to actually use the elastic recoil to propel off the ground. And now we've talked about the gearbox. Now we need to talk about the engine, right? There are not just bony structures and bony landmarks, there are also some other things, right? And it's important to understand that there are more muscles of supination in comparison to muscles of pronation. And what muscles of supination primarily do is that they decelerate pronation, okay? They are kind of the brakes. And if those brakes stay on too long, the foot cannot yield to gravity. And for street lifters, tight calves are often just brakes that refuse to let go, so preventing the tibia from moving forward during a squat. And this usually has to do with either the calcaneus, so the heel, being stuck, or us having limitations elsewhere up the chain, primarily referring to the hip. Okay, and yeah, weak looking feet or often overworking and they're not undertrained, okay? That is because the body doesn't have access to certain movement patterns, so it starts to orientate the body in that given direction, so it can kind of fake the limit or restricted movement pattern. And therefore, those muscles, they are actually overactive rather than undertrained. And therefore, we really need to help them, learn the missing movement strategy. And either we need to learn how to pronate the foot or how to supinate the foot. Okay? And pronation is kind of an internal rotation strategy. That means there is an internal rotation down the chain. When we pronate the foot, so flatten out the foot, we can see the tibia, the femur, and the hip, so the shin, the upper leg bone, and the pelvis to internally rotate. As the shin moves over the toes, we can also see dorsiflexion, and dorsiflexion is also a strategy of internal rotation. Okay, but during pronation, not just the shin moves over the toes, but also the heel will start to roll forward into plantar flexion, and the toes splay and create a gap in between so that the foot can actually flatten and the arch can drop closer to the ground. And this is what stretches the plantar tissues. So basically the windlass mechanism gets activated to store elastic energy. And without this yielding strategy, the eccentric phase of your lift becomes very muscularly expansive because you have no elastic recoil to help you back up out of that position. And obviously the second movement strategy that we have is supination, and that is our drive, right? And we need to differentiate between early supination and late supination. Early supination is when the heel hits the ground, and late supination is when the foot kicks off the ground. Both positions or both movements are looking relatively similar, except that obviously in the late supination, so the push off phase, we can see a big toe that is more so extended. Okay, so that is very, very important. And as a result, obviously the foot shape is slightly different, as I said, but we don't need to worry about that too much. Okay, the only thing that you gotta keep in mind here is supination means the foot arch is relatively high, and as the foot arch is relatively high, the foot is obviously in a supinated position. Therefore, the tibia needs to be in external rotation, the femur in external rotation, the hip in external rotation. Okay, to make it simple, shin, upper leg, and pelvis, they need to be in a slightly externally rotated position. Why does this matter for street lifting? Okay, as you drive out of the hole in a squat, you need the hip to extend and the big toe to tension the fascia. Okay, and if your foot rolls to the outside and loses the big toe, your rigid lever has broken and you are leaking force. Okay, so you cannot produce force into the ground. You can try that by yourself. Try to run on the outside of your foot or just on your heels without rolling actually off the big toe. I suppose you cannot produce any force. Or let's try another analogy. Try to jump off from your heels. I bet you're not gonna jump high. Now try to jump off from your toes. See, you jumped relatively high, right? And this is where we produce force. The heel, that's where we strike the ground, that's where we absorb force. Initially the foot is rigid, we smash it into the ground, the foot becomes more malleable, then the foot needs to re-stiffen so we can actually propel off the ground. Now, there is a lot more behind it, right? Because it is not just the foot arch that needs to drop closer to the ground. There is kind of a sequence up through the whole chain. What does that mean? There is the shin, the tibia, the fibula, the femur, okay? These are structures. Those two bones create a joint, which is the so-called knee joint. And these bones need to move in relation to each other. When we pronate the foot, the tibia needs to internally rotate and the femur needs to internally rotate. As we supinate, the tibia needs to externally rotate and the femur needs to externally rotate. And this is important because many knee valgus issues in heavy squats are actually tibial sequencing problems. Okay, that means if the hip cannot rotate to accept the load, to absorb force, the load tries to do the job. What does that mean? If the foot is locked, the knee will pay the price, and it shows up as knee valgus, the knees coming inward. But we gotta keep in mind, we are talking about coupling rules here, and within those coupling rules, there is relative motion, okay? And as we talk about relative motion, we have to distinguish between the foot bones twisting and moving, rotating to manage load, okay, and orientation. The whole foot moving in the same direction or the whole foot dumping in the same direction. Relative motion means structures within a bigger structure moving individually from each other. So each joint has access to the necessary movements that are needed to achieve said task. Orientation is basically our compensation. If we are lacking relative motion, so the ability of the joints within that structure moving independently from each other, if that movement is restricted and those joints don't move relative to each other, the whole structure orientates in the same direction. And here we then see the claw, people gripping the ground very, very hard to fake stability, or the drift where the heel fails to invert and come inward again as we pronate the foot, or just dumping the ankles inward, knee valgus, and all of that stuff, right? And this is kind of the cornerstone. Also, when we talk about the tibia and the femur, right? Both structures are moving in the same direction. As we pronate, the tibia internally rotates and the femur internally rotates. But also between those two structures, there is some relative motion, okay? As we bend the knee, the tibia internally rotates and the femur externally rotates at the same pace, just at a different magnitude, so at a different speed. And as it moves at a different speed, it moves in the opposite direction. I know that might sound complicated, but this is actually what we are trying to fix in coaching. And when it comes to rehab and prehab, why is that the case? Because usually injuries and discomfort tend to happen because we are lacking movement. And most of the time, this is relative movement. And as we're lacking relative movement, the body orientates in the same direction to actually achieve the movement, but it's like a compensation and it's not genuine motion. Then we need to talk about assessments, or at least some things that we want to look for, right? When it comes to pronation, the first thing we look at is the heel, okay? The heel is of utmost importance. Can the calcaneus, that's the biggest bone there in the back, can roll forward and in and outward into inversion and eversion. Then we look at the foot arch. Can the foot arch drop closer to the ground, or does the ankle dump inward? Do we compensate by rolling off the ball of the big toe instead of the toes, right? And these are things that we really need to understand and learn to see, because they tell us a story. Things like limited internal rotation up the chain or limited pronation capabilities, right? And when it comes to supination, it's all about, can we actually hold on to the tripod foot? Tripod foot here, okay, is not about gripping and crawling the ground. The tripod foot is about points of contact. We want to have the heel, the first and the fifth mat head in contact with the ground. The first and fifth mat head is the ball of the big toe and the ball of the pinky. And what we will likely see if the foot is actually supinating properly is that we will see an arch that is slightly lifted, okay? And remember, there are two different supination foot shapes, and if we cannot roll off the big toe, we will likely miss hip extension. Okay, so if the big toe is not driving into the ground, you cannot effectively produce force later in the lift. And that is very important because that is the limiting factor for force production. Now, let's talk about the decision metrics. When to train what? When should you train pronation? When to train supination? Okay, then usually I'd recommend to train pronation if you have a high, rigid foot arch, okay? So if your feet are literally stuck, like they're a brick, everything is rotated out, you shift all of the foot onto the outer foot, then this would be one of the first signs where I'd highly recommend to learn how to actually pronate, because that will be needed for you to access the windlass mechanism and then to actually use the rigid foot shape that you already have. And when it comes to supination, I'd recommend to train that if someone has a collapsed arch or can't hold a side to absorb force. So you might have a side that is restricted in hip mobility, in particular hip internal rotation. That's usually the side that we're lacking, or that we tend to avoid during squatting and hinging movements, and we tend to shift into our preferred side. And usually the side that we avoid is the one where we should actually train more supination, because it will help to, first of all, absorb force, move generally into pronation, and then actually propel off the ground how it's supposed to be. And when it comes to interventions, I use a 5-step framework. We start by restoring relative motion. We've talked about the heel, the foot needs to move. If the foot is rigid like a brick, we need to give the foot and the structure surrounding it some movement, okay? And we usually start by untwisting the tibia. That means we work on internal and external rotation of the tibia so the tibia can translate forward and backward. And we need to mobilize the calcaneus, the heel. We can do so by using different manual techniques or certain exercises that really help to unlock more movement in those areas. And then when we have unlocked a little bit of movement, we start to pattern in the first slow speed drills. Okay, here we go through gentle motion. It's all about learning the basics of pronation and supination before making it a little bit harder and increasing the intensity. Then the next level that we're going to use is isometrics. These will be very, very important, and sometimes I even use them in earlier stages, especially if we're coming back from a severe injury, like torn ligaments and so on, very fresh injuries. Then we might start off with isometrics right away, but usually I tend to implement them as soon as we've unlocked the first movement, and this will really help us to improve the co-contraction for connective tissue health. Okay, connective tissues such as ligaments and tendons, they do grow at the different rate as muscles do and with a different stimulus. So we need to train them in a different manner. And then obviously after going through split squat isometrics, we can move into more loaded, more dynamic patterns like a split squat with pronation bias before we move into more heavy impact stuff. In this case here, plyometrics or some of the best lower body or lower limb and foot exercises out there, and they are the logical progression of the previous ones. Okay, plyometrics, you need to learn how to produce force into the ground, yield as you land, propel off again, and yeah. So basically, plyometrics is where we integrate it into the whole system, where everything starts to make more sense, and where we start to move the foot as it's supposed to. And yeah, one more thing I wanted to add on here is the practical application of toe float and heel float exercises. A heel float exercise is basically you just standing on your toes, and a toe float exercise is where the whole foot is elevated except the toes, and the toes hanging off a plate or a yoga block, ramp, whatever you're going to use. And the goal here is to kind of let the toes hover off the box or the plate, whatever you're using for the toe float one, and it will really help to bias internal rotation at the tibia, help you unlock more pronation. And on the heel float, you really learn how to bias tibial external rotation, get that big toe pressure into the ground, which is amazing for creating stiffness, co-contraction, and especially important for athletes needing propulsion. So athletes that actually train for street lifting or powerlifting, right, where the goal is to produce the most amount of force. And usually the toe float exercise is the better one for people who tend to present with an anterior pelvic tilt. And the heel float exercise is usually better for those who tend to present with this tucked under pelvis. And yeah, and some final thoughts for this session. Don't label flat feet or high arches, okay? Look for access to motion. The lower limb's job is to transition smoothly between yielding and propulsion, especially under heavy load. Okay, and if you cannot do that, it's all about restoring those motions in the first place, so we don't drive more into compensatory patterns and actually learn how to perform well, because that is what puts kilos on the total. And if you want more kilos on your total, or just want to know how these works and want to dive deeper into that stuff, then reach out for my biomechanic mentorship cohort that starts in the second week of March. If you want more infos, just reach out. I'll send you all the details. If you don't want to know how these things work and you want someone who does it for you, then I've also got a few spots open for my one-on-one online coaching. Also, the link is in the description down below. And yeah, that's a wrap for today. If you haven't done yet, please help me grow this channel by liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and turning on the notifications so you don't miss out on any new video. That's a wrap for today. See you in the next one.